Thank you. I've been fly fishing for almost 10 years now, and if you ever want to truly disconnect from the technological world, that is one of the best ways, because you can't actually talk or on your phone while actually casting. So I highly recommend it. So I'm very excited to kind of give this talk, because a lot of us, DevOps should probably not be an unfamiliar term anymore. If companies aren't already doing some flavor of DevOps, there's probably some sort of line item on the overall roadmap to kind of start looking at that. And the thing around QA or QE supporting DevOps is that there's not necessarily specific areas. Here's your playbook, and then once you can check mark each of these line items, then now magically you are a fully 100% supported QE that supports DevOps, right? The idea, as well as with DevOps, kind of the mantra of DevOps, is that it's the culture and it's the approach. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the modern QA or QE role and how we support DevOps. But really, the idea here is that when the next thing comes after DevOps or during DevOps, you can simply fill in the blank and say, the modern QA role supporting blank the smart way, right? So we're going to really talk a little bit about the concepts around DevOps and the modernization of the role of QA. So I do use QA and QE slightly differently, and I talk a little bit about how we define the QE role. I would love to hear your thoughts, especially for those of you who are actively practicing as quality engineers. This is designed to be somewhat collaborative, so I will not ask you to wait until the end, especially because we have 90 minutes together. So if there are questions, if you need clarity, any of the slides in here, I would welcome some either questions or feedback for you to share while we kind of learn from each other. All right, so let's get started. So what are we going to talk about today? Specifically, the quality engineering role, as I mentioned. I'm going to define that a little bit. The construction project analogy, right? How many of you have heard of how, I love this story. I've been in my industry for more than 20 years, and still to this day, every time I ask my mother, or someone asks my mother, what does your daughter Melissa do? She works on computers. Since day one, I started in my career, and she still doesn't have a concept. So a lot of times when we're talking with people who may not have an intimate knowledge or in their what we're doing, their standard answer is, well, she just works on computers. Well, a lot of times what we try and do is to explain things to people like my mother is we try and analogize, right? So we use the construction project analogy, right? How many of you have heard of like building software is just like building construction project, and you kind of like piecemeal, right? So it's a pretty common analogy. And I want to talk a little bit about kind of the take that I'd like us to consider when we talk about using the analogy of a construction project, and specifically the role of QA versus the role of QE on a construction project. We're going to talk a little bit about retuning automation and the automation approaches that we may have had or instilled and have implemented in the past, and maybe retuning it a little bit to modernize, specifically as we move into the more innovative approaches for software development and the delivery of that software development via DevOps. We're going to talk a little bit about shifting some of those more traditional QA tasks from the right closer to the left, right? Everyone has heard, or most everyone has probably heard of the shift left mentality, right? It's a pretty common theme, and I don't want to oversaturate that, but there are a lot of good components when we think about the act of shifting things that have traditionally laid to the right in the SDLC, closer to the user, closer to the delivery. Excuse me, I should go this way since you're looking this way. To the user from the tech side, right? So your right, my left, but to the right, these traditional tasks, things that we tend to do right before we're getting ready to deliver the software, and ways to be extremely efficient and optimized and pull some of those traditional tasks from the right closer to the left to ideally take advantage of the continuous everything that approaches such as DevOps introduces to the SDLC. We're going to talk a little bit about what the modern testing role looks like. and give some examples of more what we would kind of consider some outdated ways to approach QA and modernizing them, giving them a little bit of a fresh coat of paint, so to speak, to make them fresher and more modernized and innovative. And then we're going to talk a little bit about one of my favorite topics, which is redefining refinement, or redefining refining, and kind of how we can take back one of those arduous meetings and tasks that tend to be associated when we have a refinement or a grooming session as an all team, and kind of, again, looking at that from a modern approach and really taking advantage of that very critical ceremony within Agile, regardless of the flavor of those, and kind of taking that traditional definition of what a refinement means, who owns that, and really taking that back into the team so that we can maximize the value of what a refinement really offers us. And then kind of tying that all together with the component of shippable, right? And so we kind of have lots of, columns that indicate something is done. We have dev complete, we have QA complete, and a lot of times what we wind up missing is what actually needs to happen in order for this to move and to be deployed and to be delightfully consumed by our users. And a lot of times we miss a lot of that, and things that DevOps introduces, and even from a concept form, is that we want to be highly efficient. And one of the ways that we become highly efficient is by automating, right? And so we all know the benefits of automation, and not simply just test automation, but automating repetitive and redundant tasks, right? And so automation is one of those components, one of the core characteristics of what makes DevOps DevOps. So we're gonna talk a lot about some of these concepts. And then at the end, because I always get this, I'll answer two questions. Number one, yes, these slides will be available, so I will make sure that they are if they're not already available. And I'm happy to email those out or to send those out to anyone that asks, or give you the link to where they're in there if they're not already at the conference proceedings. But one of the biggest questions that I get is if I can share our definition of done and kind of examples that we've used to introduce definitions of done at companies, whether I'm as a consultant or as an employee, kind of starting or building out quality engineering teams. And so I've included that in my slides so that you kind of have all one big package there, okay? All right, so the biggest thing right now is we're going to talk about the quality engineering role and what I like to call is the misbuster versus the mythbuster in there. And so really it's kind of busting the misperceptions of quality assurance. And if any of these ring true, either recently or you're currently experiencing those, give me a little smile or a nod of head or a raising of the hand, okay? So misperception of quality assurance, right? So why am I so kind of bent on distinguishing between quality engineering and quality assurance? Because it's really just one word change. Oh, you just remove the assurance and just slap on engineering and voila, you are a now quality engineer. Of course, we know that that's not correct. Otherwise, this would be a super short session and I would bid you adieu and go get some coffee, right? Of course, that's not really the thing. There's one team that owns quality, right? Well, I don't really need to test my own stuff because we have a whole team that is responsible for doing that, right? They have quality in their title. Of course they're responsible for quality, right? It's not a skill. You know what? Hey, look, this person coming from a different side of the business really knows our application, our platform, our software really, really well because they use it day in and day out and day in and day out. And they're looking for a career change. Let's just bring them in. Anybody can test QA. Anybody that knows the software can absolutely start and be a functioning member of the team on day one simply because they know the software. Now, I will say that is exactly how I started in my career. So I will say that in a lot of cases, that does work out. But there's a lot of mentoring, there's a lot of training, there's a lot of things that need to be piggybacked off of that model. In fact, it is actually a great model, especially for those of you who are working within companies or industries that do require that deep-seated product and domain expertise, right? So certainly not knocking it, but to simply say that anyone can test and it's not really a skill, and therefore we can bring somebody from the business, magically throw them a title, and then let them fend for themselves, that's not really fair to that person, but certainly not fair to our industry, especially since we've got conferences that focus on testing and quality assurance as a profession and as a skill set. So hey, if something is released into production, right, we've got a live and an issue is found. Well, whose fault is it? Well, it's generally QA's fault, right? Or most of the time, we come see, and this has happened to me many, many times in my career, where we have just released a nasty bug and our customer support or our help desk is lighting up because we've made a grave mistake. Well, me as the director or manager or lead QA, I'm probably the first person that VP or CTO or CIO is going to come to, right? Because, well, you were the last ones to touch it, so therefore you are responsible for anything that's left your hands and has ultimately been released into production, right? How many of those have resonated with you sometime in the near past? Okay, most of you are raising your hand, right? Hopefully, this slide will no longer need to be part of this deck, but until I see no hands raised, I'm going to continue to add this in there because I think it's really good for us to understand where our industry is taking us and some of the things that we've done in the industry to perpetuate these misperceptions of what quality assurance is. And so now we talk about some of the other misperceptions, right? So mistake finders, and this is another one here. So, and so sometimes we do find these, right? Well, so if you're the last person to touch the code before we release that into production, well, then everything that has happened to the left of you will ultimately roll downhill, and then you become that nice receptacle of finding all of the mistakes, and you are expected to fix them or to address them because you're the last line before we get into production. The catch-off for failed processes. Well, that acceptance criteria is completely ambiguous. Why wasn't it tested correctly? Well, because it was completely ambiguous and it passed through at least 2 other teams before it got to QA in some capacity. And so we become that catch-off for all of the failed processes that have happened to the left of us. And then one of the biggest misperceptions of quality assurance is that we're responsible solely for all of the testing within the SDLC. And if you've ever worked with fabulous developers, which I've worked with for a long time, you know that there is testing that is happening at the individual level and at the team level that most of the time is just never really shared because it's not considered a major function. And let's be honest, developers don't really like to document a lot of the things that they're finding. They'd rather have those conversations, or they'd rather just kind of sit in the corner sometimes and just get their work done, not really share all the things that they're doing, right? But the idea is that has instilled and introduced this misperception that because our main focus and role is to test the things, that now we are responsible for all of the testing that happens within the SDLC. All right, so those are the misperceptions of quality assurance. So things that I've done in the last, say, 8 to 10 years of my career, and especially since I've been kind of touting this role of the quality engineer, a lot of times when I consult with or I join companies, I've been very fortunate in my career to be able to kind of help companies transform from the more traditional ways of quality assurance into the quality engineering role. And again, sometimes it does come with a title change. Sometimes you are simply changing that assurance into engineering. But most of the time, it's the characteristics and the components of what makes a good quality engineer, right? So the best way that we can really kind of think about what does an engineer actually do? And of course, there are professional organizations that exist all across the world around engineering specifically, mechanical, civil, software engineering, all there's not really that same concept for software engineering, or for quality engineering, but we kind of pull a lot of those characteristics and components in there and really introduce the things that make an engineer into the quality engineering role. So we do that by kind of, and in my definition, we do this by kind of defining the role of engineering as define, design, build, execute, measure, and report. And all of those 6 characteristics are kind of what embody the quality engineering role. So we define, right? So we define the success, outcome, and the measurements that we're going to use. Sometimes people would call this strategizing or planning, and sometimes there is a document that's produced that says all the things that we're going to be doing. FYI, not a big fan of over-documentation, so, but sometimes there are companies that require separate kinds of documents. The worst thing that can come out of this is that we produce more documentation versus having the conversations and using those more agile ceremonies like refinement and planning and all the other things to kind of start the conversations here. So hopefully this does not result in a bunch of documentation coming from you, but it's the idea and the concept of planning. And we do that by defining what we believe success, outcome, and how we're going to measure those are in relation to what success is within the Agile project team. The next one is we design. So we design that strategy. And again, sometimes it looks like a document, but most of the time it's us kind of creating an outline of things that we need to do, picking up explicit and implicit information along the way, and actually designing that strategy based off of that first point of defining. And then we build the solution, right? In some cases, that's going to look like we start building the tests. We might build the automated scripts. We're going to build a tool that will aid us in data, addition of data or deleting the data and all that. So we're going to build that solution based off of those first 2 bullet points. And then, of course, we're going to execute it. We're going to test, or we're going to push that button to run those test scripts. We're going to actually make sure that we have a good balance of not only implementing the tools and the technology that we've designed, but that we're actually going to make sure that we're spending time exploring the software and advocating for our users. And then we're going to measure that. Hey, when we first started out, we said this would do this. Does it actually do that? We're going to measure those results, and we're going to measure those incrementally along the way so that we can report on the outcome, but not just at the end of the testing thing. Well, we had 500 test cases that we needed to execute. All 5 of those are running green, or the ones that are running red have a bug assessed to them, and product has decided we're not going to go in there, right? So that's pretty typical for how we generally report on our findings. But what I would say is that we report on the information that we're gathering throughout all of these 5 phases above that, right? So when we think about the definition of a quality engineer and we emphasize the engineer, here are the components of that engineering role and characteristics that I want us to kind of use to guide the conversation moving forward. And the best way that we kind of define that in a better and more of a nutshell is that a quality engineer is influential in the building of the software before the software is built. So I'll kind of let that sit for a second, because some of you may be thinking, well, I don't even see the software until it's dev complete, until I see that card in my Jira board move from in dev or in process into ready for QA, right? And so a lot of times, that's the first time that we're even seeing what our next role is. So you can probably guess where I'm going to go, and that's too late, okay? So the first time you're seeing something is when that card is actually coming to you and the dev is already complete, or at least it's already started, that's already too late. So we want to get to this North Star of this quote: we are influential in the building of the software before the software is being built. And so the concept of DevOps and why the quality engineering role, the modern QE role, goes hand in hand and supports the DevOps mentality so well is that DevOps is really kind of optimization and efficiency on steroids. It's extremely optimized and extremely efficient, and we won't be able to support initiatives and approaches like DevOps unless we, in turn, are highly optimized and highly efficient, which equals high productivity, right? Okay, so things and characteristics that the quality engineering role helps with. So we balance technical acumen with user advocacy. We emphasize equally both of those, right? And so I did a talk a few years ago, and I actually still do this talk, but it's kind of using the pendulum. Everybody know what a pendulum is? Kind of a shifting, like a clock pendulum, right? So a pendulum in nature always desires balance. So if it shifts to the right and it swings all the way to your left, my right, it is going to find that equal balance on the other side, right? But ultimately, it is always seeking to provide and to have the balance of right in the middle. So the idea behind using a pendulum to kind of gauge the balance of things is that when I started my career 20 plus years ago, I was a user of the software. I was a pretty good user of the software. I happened to be a very broke recent college graduate, and I was looking for more money, and the opportunity to test the software on weekends and the evenings presented itself. You could have literally told me I was going to be holding signs on the street. I would have literally picked up any job at that point because, again, I was a broke, recent college graduate. So I jumped at the opportunity to test software. I had no idea what I was doing, but the idea was that we wanted users to experience the software. And so by nature of me having my first role as a tester because I was an experienced user of the software, I was automatically advocating for the user because I was always thinking about the user. And as you kind of shift from 20 years ago closer to the present, you see that pendulum also shift, right? So where that pendulum lied very, very much to the right, and we were always advocating for the users because me personally, didn't have a lot of technical skills to really get under the hood of that code, but I could test the hell out of that software and really find the bugs that our typical users would be finding, right? And so as you kind of fast forward, you see the onset of much more technical roles within QA. You saw the software engineering and test, the SDET, automation engineers, performance engineers, people and skills that require deep, deep technical knowledge. Test code, write code in order to test code tended to be that mantra, right? And so what we wound up happening is, so whereas that pendulum really was kind of squarely to the right and we were always advocating for a user, but not much else, we shifted that pendulum all the way to the left to where we were deeply technical and we were able to support the technical components happening within the SDLC, but we in some ways left out that user, right? And so the idea with the pendulum is that we can swing as far to the right as we need to, but we're always going to need to swing back to the left and strike that balance. So again, kind of using themes throughout this talk, the pendulum really is that reminder that we, as a quality engineer, we are striking the balance equally, and we're putting equal emphasis on both the user advocacy as well as the technical acumen. And of course, we're context-driven, right? There's a whole bunch of definitions around this, but one of my favorite definitions of how we define context-driven, given the information that we have, explicit information, things in like user stories with acceptance criteria, or requirements, or even stand-up conversations that we're having, that's all explicit information and should be centralized to the team so that we don't have to continue to have one-off conversations whenever we determine and find explicit information. But more importantly, we dig into the implicit information. What's the information that only I know, or because I had lunch with somebody in our client services team that I know because they shared some things with us. So making that implicit information and using that implicit information and then doing a solid for the rest of the team and making it explicit. So the idea is that context-driven is not only do we do the right things with the centralized information that everybody on the team should be using, but that we're looking for and finding implicit information to make a comprehensive solution available, and we're making that implicit information explicit. Okay? All right. So we talked a little bit about the construction role. So when you think about typical construction, how many of you have been actively involved in some sort of construction project as a homeowner or something like that, right? Pretty familiar. Okay, most of your hands have gone up. I've personally never had a house or a home built, but I've had a lot of friends and family who have. So you can kind of get the general gist of what a construction project looks like, right? So we have some typical roles. We have an architect. We have the skilled tradespeople, the plumbers, the drywallers, the electricians, the flooring people. We have the general contractor. We have the project manager, somebody who's responsible for the numbers, the budget, kind of coordinating all that. We have the building inspector, the one that comes in and says, yep, you are meeting code, or nope, you're not meeting code. And then, of course, we have the customer, the person that we're actively building this project for. So when you think about these traditional roles in a construction project, which one makes the most sense for QA? Customer? Inspector? How many of you say inspector? Okay, how many of you say one of the other roles? I love the customer. You're the first one that has said customer. Did you say yes, another role? Project manager, okay. Anyone else? Skilled tradespeople, okay, so maybe they're part of the plumbers, the electricians, the flooring, the drywall. They have a very specific experience with tradespeople. Okay, so most of the time when I ask that question, most people, and it's pretty much the same here, raised their hand or shouted out the building inspector, right, or the inspector, because that is kind of what we've been told our role has been. Look, dev can't be trusted to really follow the stuff, so we need somebody else to come in and tell them what they've done, right? And so that's kind of, whether it's right or wrong, most of us have followed our career with us having the main premise of our role is to point out the faults and the things that people to the left of us have done, right? And so that's why the building inspector has tended to be one of those roles where it makes sense. So when I'm talking to my mom and I say, well, you know how a building inspector comes out and checks and makes sure like that the electrical's right and the plumbing's right? She's like, yeah, well, that's kind of what QA does. And so, of course, a week later when somebody asks, well, what does Melissa do again? Well, she works on computers, right? So that information very rarely gets absorbed, and I can joke about my mom about that because she's actually heard me talk, and she's very lovely, and she'll sit there and she goes, I just had no idea what you were saying. But Mom, you sat there for an hour. I don't know, it was just fun to see my daughter up there talking, right? But I had no idea what you do. Okay, so that ship has sailed. I am no longer going to try and convince my mom, or I'm going to no longer try and have her explain exactly what we do in testing, let alone quality engineering, right? So kind of going back to the building inspector, here are the things that are misperceptions around that role of QA as an inspector. It instills a false sense of non-ownership with development. Well, if somebody's there to check that I've actually done what I'm supposed to do, then why do I need to do it, right? I'm just going to produce as much code as possible, and whether it's quality code, well, we'll let somebody else think of that, right? Because now we have this whole team that is responsible for testing to make sure that you did what you're supposed to do, right? So misperception number one. Misperception number two, it assumes that they can't be trusted, right? Well, I'm sorry, electrician, you just can't follow that code. Yes, I know that it's very clear, and I know that it is in very much a checklist form, but we don't trust that you can do it on your own, so we're gonna have somebody come back in. Even though you may have already vetted it out with code reviews, paired, single or more approvers for code reviews, and somebody else has eyes on it, but we simply don't trust you, so we're gonna put this team in there. Well, if I've been told for most of my career that I can't be trusted, even if those words aren't used that way, well, then I'm going to probably take advantage of not doing it myself, and I'm going to let that team or that person on my project team do it for me, because at the end of the day, sometimes, myself included, laziness sometimes trumps innovation, right? If I can get out of here at 4:30, instead of 5 o'clock by double checking my work, I'm probably gonna take the former because there's a great show on TV or the game's on or a bunch of people are meeting at the bar later, right? So we assume by having that QA as an inspector mentality that our other teammates can't be trusted with what they're doing. And then, of course, it ultimately creates an us versus them mentality. Well, Deb, you were supposed to do it this way, and you didn't do it this way, and I just checked through all the requirements, and this requirement was missed, or this acceptance criteria is missed. See, you can't be trusted, and now there's even more of a reason, and now as QA, I have to test all of the things, even though you told me that you were gonna test other things, right? So we kind of get into that us versus them mentality. Have any of these resonated with you, or are you currently experiencing some of these right now as your role currently as a QA? Okay, so some of you have raised your hands, right? Okay, and then what winds up happening is that QA becomes that crutch. So when you think about the whole concept of what DevOps does, highly optimized, highly automatable where it makes sense, not all of the things automated, although sometimes that mantra tends to get a little bit misconstrued with what DevOps is. When you've created a separate team that has these 4 perceptions or misperceptions in there, it breaks down the throughput of a highly optimized pipeline of work being delivered, right? So now you've got separate teams that may have an us versus them mentality, or things are in place where QA becomes the trust verifier, right? There was that whole thing where, what is it? Trust but verify, right? And so that's been one of our mantras. And in fact, I've seen lots of T-shirts and stickers, and I still see them around. Trust but verify. And there's not anything innately wrong with trust but verify, except when you absolutely have the trust with your developers and your role is inflated or overinflated to ensure that that stuff is happening. Agile and DevOps flourishes on that extreme trust within your teammates, and it has to allow the process and the pipeline of work to work within the team, and so that when things are found, when mistakes are found, and they're going to be done and they're going to be found, it's not the idea of, see, you can't be trusted, and now we have to test all of the things all the time because you can't be trusted. It breaks down, and it ultimately does not allow for QA in its current traditional role to really be an active player within moving into the more DevOps mindset. So my take on this is that QE really plays the role of the general contractor, and I'll give you some reasons why. So QE is familiar with multiple components of the software development lifecycle, right? We should be very familiar with all of the components. Just like a general contractor, we're going to have familiarity with how the drywall and the plumbing and the electrical needs to happen, all the things in there. But we may have had previous experience in that. We may have been a skilled tradesperson in one of those components that ultimately make up the construction project. But it's not our main role. We have enough information across the roles to understand and to be consultative and make recommendations within our sphere of technical expertise. But we're not ultimately responsible for ensuring that we can, or that the electrical is done necessarily according to code. We trust that the electrician or that skilled tradesperson on the team knows enough about their own skill to be able to do that. We can certainly fit in that role, but is that really the role, and is that really the best use of our time to simply make sure that someone followed instructions to the left of us? We work with the owner or the user throughout the course of the project. When our next door neighbors were getting their house rebuilt, the general contractor was on all of the time on that site, even if it was just coming in, but they were intimately involved with that project, and they were really the one who was working together with the owner. They were able to hear the conversations about what the owner or the customer wanted for that construction project, and they were able to interpret that into the design and into the look and feel and the experience of that construction project, right? We can vet out requirements and specific needs of the user and owner, right? And be consultative with our skilled tradespeople, our developers, so to speak, and all the other members of the construction team. And we're able to be consultative and deep dive if and when necessary. But ultimately, the best part of the QE as the general contractor role is that we're able to nimbly step into the weeds, and we're able to, more importantly, nimbly step out of the weeds and look at the holistic component of the construction project to make sure that we're both advocating for the user, but that the main function and components of the construction project are in place and as needed, okay? So like the general contractor, we can advocate. QE can advocate that the desired level of quality has been met, not necessarily that we define it, right? And I want to be very distinct in that. definition because we all know that we can't simply write a definition for what quality is. We can advocate for our opinions of what quality is, and by having that pulse, that finger on the pulse of the user, we can advocate much better for the user, but we're not necessarily defining the overall quality of that, but we are providing the information throughout so that we can at least advocate for our opinion and for the user in that component. And then we do that by offering timely and valuable feedback. Again, we use meetings like the stand-ups, like refinement, like planning, or throughout conversations throughout the day that we're going to be offering that type of valuable feedback. And we can be consultative not just on the how does the software work and does it meet our requirements, but how is that user going to look and feel, how are they going to be delighted, and what is their experience going to be while they're interacting within the software, okay? All right, so we're gonna talk about some components of kind of traditional ways that we move into modernization of the QA role into QE so that it supports modern approaches like DevOps. So retuning our test automation, and specifically automation here from a test automation standpoint. One of the best quotes, this has followed me around for many, many years now, but test automation makes humans more efficient, not less essential. And so if you are still in an organization where test automation is somehow viewed to be a bottom line capital expenditure where there is a desire or a need to implement a heavy test automation strategy and then remove people from that, then you're probably not going to be successful within a whole test automation strategy because we've already taken out the people component, and you can know that we can never replace a person's brain with a tool, right? And especially from a test automation tool. So we developed this quote many years ago to make sure that for those of you who may still be in the situation where you're not sure where test automation fits with you and your role, and you're not eagerly embracing its benefits, this is the quote for you. So what has traditional test automation been? It's been monolithic. And monolithic should resonate. That's a word that is very much part of the DevOps mantra, to not be monolithic, right? But usually we have one big, huge suite of regression tests that are run overnight because they're so big, they take 6-8 hours to run. So we actually have to kick them off after business hours, and hopefully they will run overnight, and the lucky person that gets into work the next morning gets to look and review all the failures or the passes in there, right? Most of the time it's failures, or most of the time we're spending time looking at those failures. I've very rarely seen a monolithic suite of tests that takes more than a couple of hours to run that results in 0 failures, right? But we've already created we've already put a barrier in from the test automation because it's so big and monolithic that we have to run them when no one else is using the system, and generally overnight, right? So it's tended to be more monolithic. It's focused on everything, and by everything I mean everything, right? And so we still hear a lot of the quotes of, we'll just automate X percentage of test cases, right? And so if we have 1,000 test cases, well, our goal should be to automate 950 of those, and then we will magically be up to 95% test automation, and then we'll have a higher quality product, right? That works great, right? No, of course we know that that doesn't work great, right? But when we think about our test automation strategy, that is generally what we focused on, is we focused on do everything and automate to a certain number or to a certain percentage of test cases that are actually automated, right? And there are 2 things that we focus on. We tend to say that test cases drive automation versus having the person with test automation experience drive what should be automated way to the left of that, right? And that tends to be a very typical test automation strategy that we have in place now. And then it's the numbers game, and I kind of mentioned this earlier, but we focus on either a number or a certain percentage of test cases because we say, well, it takes 10 people 2 weeks to run all of these test cases to get ready for deployment, and it's all of our regression test cases. So if we can automate those, then we can either get rid of those 10 people or some portion of those 10 people, or we can focus them on other things, right? And so that's generally been why we have implemented test automation strategies that has been a little bit less modern and not as innovative to be able to support something as modern as DevOps. So other things, what should it be? So if we don't want it to be monolithic and a numbers game and all that, what should test automation be? So it should be a tiered approach, right? Or multiple runs for multiple dones, right? And so remove that monolithic suite of tests that takes 6 to 8 hours to run every night and choose it to have instant feedback for the people that really should be consuming it. And it could be automation as a service. We have everything else as a service, right? We have software as a service. We have testing as a service. Let's look at automation, test automation as a service, right? And so we move into those as a service, and we start looking at how do we logically break down this monolithic suite of automation to be able to support the good and valuable activities that are happening within our SDLC. And ideally, it's going to provide the most valuable information as soon as possible, or as soon as we need that information. Again, we look at the example of a monolithic suite of tests running overnight. Well, nobody's really looking at that suite except that first automation engineer, that first person that comes into the office in the morning, right? So they're the ones that have to vet out all that data, and then maybe a couple of hours after coming up for air, they look at that and say, oh, you know what, actually, just these tests need to be retuned. Everything's good with the software, didn't actually find anything valuable, right? So when we think about a tiered approach and looking at the concepts from a DevOps standpoint, microservices, non-monolithic, we want to take that same approach and actually apply it to some of our traditional testing activities. And one of the biggest ones to apply that to would be test automation. So there is a metric that I really like to use. It's called the A of A, and it means the automated of automatable. And so when we start thinking about, well, I need a percentage or I need a number to make sure that everybody knows that I'm doing this correctly, one of the best ways to retune how you measure and how you come up with and report on a metric is to use this concept called automated of automatable. So as you've gone in and identified areas that should be automated according to your team's automation strategy, what percentage of those things that you defined have actually been automatable? And that drives way up in the 90% because you're actually having those conversations, again, before that code even starts being built, especially with the modern quality engineer, influence the building of the software before the software is being built. We actually apply that concept of the A of A, or the automated of automatable. We actually use that to a very specific and concentrated metric that shows the right type of automation, not just simply tying it to the number of test cases that we've automated. Okay? All right. So the modern approach now, we're moving into continuous, right? So DevOps, automate, and continuous, right? The first thing that comes out of the DevOps movement is continuous improvement. When we think about continuously improving our trade or our practice of QA to QE, why do we do this? Ask those questions. Why are we doing this? What value does it provide to our user and back to our project team? And if the answer is, well, so-and-so with a VP title or a C-level title asked that we do this, that's probably not going to be valuable to anyone else but that one person. And that's okay, but as quality engineers, we should be ready to say what will give up or what will not happen if we trade off doing these things for one person or just a small set of people, where we can't tie that to value back to either the user or to the team that we're working with day to day. And more importantly, one of the best questions that I like to ask, especially as I join a new company or the first couple of months that I'm within a new company, is what happens if we just stop doing this? And that's one of the first questions that I ask when we go into organizations that produce heavy test plans or test strategies that are not in an industry where they're regulated and where they're absolutely required, right? And it's still surprising to me when we ask, when I ask the question of, are you producing a separate test plan document, and get emphatic nods. Let me see, one of your latest versions of a test plan. And a lot of times it's 10, 15, 20 pages long. And when I ask the question, well, what happens if we stop producing this? Most of the time, the answer to that question is, well, I don't know, but I just know that I'm expected to do this, and I house them here. And we look back to the history of who's actually looked at that test plan. It is negligible compared to the amount of effort that goes in there, right? So it's not as important to ask, why do we do this, as much as for those activities that we may see as being a little bit more inflated or bloated or wasteful, what happens if we stop? And sometimes just stop doing it and see, is there anyone that's actually complaining? Is someone's hair going to catch on fire by stopping doing something that has clearly not provided as much value as the effort it took to actually produce that? Okay? All right. So the modern QE, and again, supporting the DevOps approach here, we move from more traditional specialist roles and we move them more towards generalist, right? So a quality engineer really has specialties. Sometimes they have multiple specialties in test automation. We have in accessibility. How many of you have a well thought out and implemented plan for accessibility testing? Okay, not very many hands, right? So when we think about how we can be efficient with our role of QA, and especially moving into QE, we remove the things that have not previously provided value, but we don't remove those so that we can leave early from work. We actually replace those with highly more valuable things or activities that we haven't previously had the time to do, like accessibility testing. This is one of the biggest things. When we've implemented and transformed from QA to QE, we generally uncover about 25 to 30% of inefficient waste, essentially. And we replace that with things that are highly valuable, especially to our users, like accessibility, right? And so we've been able to actually introduce more practices and services and activities of testing that we had never had time to do because we're finely tuning and optimizing our own pipeline of work to follow the adage of DevOps and optimizing and continuous and automating everything, or automating most of the things. We look at functional security, right? And so a lot of times this scares people. Oh, no, I'm not an ethical hacker. No, I don't do AppSec stuff. That's done by another team down the road, and I don't really want to be responsible for security testing. Well, there are things that within a functional security testing standpoint that we can absolutely bring into the fold. So we're getting to the point where we had previously had these specialist roles, like test automation, like performance engineering, like accessibility engineering, and we've brought some of those characteristics into the role of the quality engineer so that the quality engineer becomes much more generalized, but with specifics. And when you start looking at how do you staff a team of quality engineers, you find quality engineers with specialties in areas that you either need to have or that you would like to have. But at the end of the day, we're quality engineers, and we may have some specialists, but we're able to take on that general contractor role and be consultative because we have enough information widely across, but we have deep information and deep expertise as far down as we need to go. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the misperceptions of regression testing, because in my experience and others' experience, one of the biggest failures or the ways that we don't quite gel with the modern DevOps approach is that we have a misperception of regression testing, right? So Misperceptions of regression testing. QA owns it solely, right? Well, I have a 2 to 3 week regression cycle that needs to be done after all the dev is complete and after all the QA is complete, and it's going to take me about 2 to 3 weeks to deliver that, and then after that, then we can maybe think about shipping this product, right? How many of you have a separate regression testing cycle that happens outside of your normal? Okay, got it. So almost half of you, right? So. And by the way, it's owned by QA. Well, we have to build in that QA regression cycle because we're the only ones that can test that, right? We can't in any way trust that our developers could regression test their own things because they're the ones that are introducing regressions, right? So we have this, this vicious cycle of who owns the regression testing cycle. And by default, QA has kind of accepted that, willingly or unwillingly, as owning it, right? And so if I'm a developer, and not only have I been told that I can't do anything and I need somebody to check it for me, but that now I don't actually have to test the things and make sure I didn't make any mistakes along the way, great, sign me up, because I don't want to do it, and I'm just going to push that off to the team that is rightfully going to own it, and they solely have that as their responsibility, right? We build in days or sometimes weeks, right? And so going back to the question that I asked, like we've got some sort of a regression testing cycle that's usually at the end of a sprint, or it's while preparing for a big release, right? So if you are following sprints, even if you're a CD, continuous deployment, there's always this kind of period of wait, hold on, we're not quite ready to deploy because I need to make sure that nothing else broke in all of the time that we've been developing and testing this code. So stop, dev, go on and do something else, and QA is going to take on the responsibility of making sure that you didn't break anything else inadvertently. So let's put a little bit of a modern flair onto that. So modern regression testing approaches is it shifts left within the sprint, right? Again, you knew I was going to have some sort of a shift left component in here. So shifting left, and what does that mean? So within a couple of days from the development. And so this is always a good reminder for us. We know the human brain can recount information up to 2 days very well, right? And so the example that I use is today's Monday. I can tell you with pretty good certainty exactly what I did on Saturday. And I could do that within a couple of seconds. I could kind of, from the time I woke up until the time I went to bed, I could give you a very good account. If you were to ask me what I did a week before that Saturday, I'd have to stop, pause, probably break out my phone, look and see what did I do, did I have any appointments that day? And you can see that I've already introduced inefficient way because I've had to context switch. So we know that the brain is much readily available and can compute things very near to what we're thinking of, and that kind of sweet spot is 2 days. So anytime that we are doing things that take us away from more than 2 days worth of dev work is automatically an inefficiency that we need to be addressing. Now, sometimes those can't be avoided, but the idea is that we want to take advantage of these daily stand-ups. The reason that a stand-up is there so that we have those daily interactions with the teams that we're going to be working with the most, not simply to go around a circle, talk about the big three, what'd you do, what are you planning on doing, any blockers, and the goal is to get out of there immediately, right? It's like, okay, yay, it was a 15-minute sprint, we got out of here in 4 minutes, great job, team, right? Well, that is completely negating the value of what a stand-up actually does with the team. And when you start thinking about using that 2-day gauge as a little bit of a guidance for you, you can start shifting your more traditional testing activities like regression testing back to where it's going to get the most and highly efficient attention from the developers, right? So anytime that you are more than 2 days away from testing things that are being delivered from dev should be looked at with a little bit of a flag to say, is there a better way to do this? We tend to, again, take full responsibility from a QA standpoint. The idea is automation as a service or as tests as a service is that we're working together with dev and we're providing dev the ability for them to test their own stuff frequently and actively. And the way that we do that is that we centralize and make accessible these tests, and we organize them the way that most software projects are organized, which is simply by feature, right? So if you looked at your product line or product lines, this is a great exercise. If you looked at a product and said, okay, how many features are in this product? Would that be an easy question for you to answer? You could say, oh yeah, it's absolutely, it's a 175 features because we are 100% feature-based organized. Or would you look at me with a blank stare and say, I have no idea. All I know is that I'm on this team and we're responsible for these features, right? So the idea is that when you start looking at holistically your product or your software as from that measurement, you can start easily organizing those products into chunkable and relatable areas so that you can start providing the tests to the developer so that they can test their own things, and it doesn't all have to completely fill up and wait until you have this massive regression cycle at the end of the project, where dev is quite honestly going to be working on the next piece of work, right? And so you've actually created more of a crevasse by putting this artificial regression cycle at the end of the cycle where dev is completely hands-off, except if we wind up finding bugs or we need answers to questions that we're asking. But for the most part, when we have those regression cycles where it's QA's only responsibility or QA's responsibility only, then dev is working on something else, and we don't have the ability to start working on that something else with our counterparts. And so if you continue that cycle throughout a year or 2 years or 3 years, you can see that the crevasse and the gap between what dev is actually able to start working on and what QA is able to work on with them, that gap becomes greater and greater every time you release more software, every time you have a sprint where you have specific QA-only tasks where dev can start on the next thing. And again, it's counterintuitive and it's actually counterproductive to what DevOps brings to the table, which is continued optimization and continued efficiency in the delivery and the design and the testing of the software that we're building. So part of the modern regression approach is that we're also gathering information and we're sharing that real time while the code is fresh in everybody's mind, right? So by taking those components of regression testing and applying those to the stories that we're actively testing, the new development, we're actually able to tap into that fresh and real-time information while, again, it's fresh in dev's mind. Okay, so when we think about testing, right, the best way that I like to organize this is say there are two types of testing. It's either scripted, and it's scripted in a traditional test management tool via test cases or in an automation framework or tools in there, or it's unscripted. And that's kind of boiling it down to its basics. We, as human testers, add much more value when we are able to explore the software in an unscripted way, but not without being embracers and adopters of tools and technology that get us to that point. So the way that we do this is that when we lay the tracks for developers to have tests as a service, scripted tests as a service, to where they have the ability and in most cases the responsibility of running those tests themselves before that code is either merged or checked in or right as part of the deployment of that code. And in a highly automated pipeline, you will want those automated tests to be kicked off according to the features that were being touched, right? And that's kind of what it looks like at the line level. And that means that when that story comes from dev into that Jira board or whatever tool you're using to track your work, the moment that story moves from dev complete into QA, the first things that we should be doing is actually exploring the story. Don't run any non-automated scripted tests. And that sounds very counterintuitive, right? Well, of course I'm going to make sure that the acceptance criteria is met, and I've got a beautiful traceability matrix that shows me that of the 10 acceptance criteria that's part of this story, I have 50 test cases that I've written a long time ago that, satisfy that, right? And so, yes, that's absolutely our urge. Our urge is to look at that story, pull the test cases out, and start running those test cases. In a modern quality engineering role, especially one that supports DevOps, those tests would have already been used to influence the building of the software, because we will have already had those conversations with development to talk about what we're going to be testing. And if you are practicing TDD, test-driven development, those tests would have already been built in as part of the code components, right? So if you're not TDD and if you don't have a fully automated pipeline of tests in there, you can do the next best thing, which is allow development to have access to your test cases, to start the conversation in those refinement sessions where we should be kind of taking back, and I talk a little bit about that. The idea is that we are moving into influencing the building of the software before the software is being built by providing those tests that we will automatically be running or writing or executing at some point, whether in an automated way or not. But we're allowing dev to take advantage of those tests versus us taking the sole responsibility of executing all scripted and unscripted tests in that manner, right? So we're shifting that to the left. So one thing that I would ask you to do is, if you have the urge to run your non-automated test cases the first moment that that story comes to you, resist the urge and explore for 15 to 30 minutes. Say, I know what this feature is. I have all of this contextual and innate and subjective knowledge, explicit and implicit information that I've gathered because I'm a professional on this team and I've been paying attention to all the things that have been happening during stand-ups and conversations and interacting with the code. I'm going to resist the urge to run those non-automated scripted test cases, and I'm going to explore this story for the first 15 to 30 minutes. I promise you that you will find way more bugs in that, using that approach, than you would by simply running and executing scripted test cases. Especially because as you start introducing this concept to dev and you give them those tests and you remind them that those tests exist there and that they should be using them as a guide for them to code, that those tests essentially should be expected to pass the moment that that code moves over to you, right? And so that becomes a secondary and less valuable exercise, because we want to increase our exploring of the software first. Because historically we know that we find bugs by exploring areas that have not previously been looked at or known up to that point, okay? So if you take one thing away from this talk, is shift your approach to when you run your scripted test cases against stories that come your way, and replace that with a 15 to 30 minute exploratory session-based session, and see what kind of bug counts you're coming up with. Or not even bug counts, but what kind of information you're able to gather and how much more valuable that information is, because you're going to be spending your time in areas that were probably previously not discussed or thought of or certainly looked at, and that's where we start providing true value. We're optimizing our time by taking advantage of tools and technology that can script our redundant type of work, because we are using our brain as the most important tool, and we're actively emphasizing and increasing the amount of time that we explore the software versus simply rotely executing test cases, okay? So in this way, the scripted tests are written before the story starts getting coded, and certainly along the way, right? So we kind of have this false sense of understanding that once we have a refinement session with our team, that's the last time we can talk about this story, right? Well, we already had a refinement session, so dev's already started, and QA will get it at some point in time to test it. And we falsely believe that that is the last conversation or formal conversation that we ever need to have on that story, right? And so, which is why we put so much emphasis on this huge team refinement, but it winds up that we wind up not having many conversations after that until QA finally gets that story to test. And now all of a sudden, what we had talked about it 2 weeks before in this big refinement session, it looks very different, because during that time, dev has experienced and has has uncovered a lot of information that has influenced how they're coding up that story. And we happen to not have a lot of great collaboration in those cases where that's information is not readily shared with QA, right? So we want to make sure that we're not falsely inflating the one and done effect of one refinement so that we never have to talk about the story again, but that we trade that for much more targeted and ad hoc collaborative and informal conversations versus having a one and done where it's one formal refinement session and that's it, right? So the way that we do that is that we are writing those tests while the development is happening, and by the time that story gets to us, the satisfying of the test cases is already done either by dev or collaboratively with dev and QA, so that the story isn't technically ready for QA, or it's not really ready for us to explore until we can see that all of those tests have passed before we actually start doing the work, right? Again, very modern approach, but you'll see a much higher quality of the code that's being delivered than we've seen previously, because we're starting to put that more modern edge of the activities from a traditional role into a modern QA. So development is referring to those tests throughout. And again, for those of you who are actively participating in a TDD approach, this probably sounds very familiar to you. For those of you who aren't, this may sound very innovative, but really what it is that we're bringing the brain of the QE to the left so that it's not one of those, it's not the throw it over the wall kind of concept, right? So we want to continue that, and we want to make sure that the test as a service is kind of guiding us throughout the development. And then, of course, we talked a little bit about explicit versus implicit information, right? So explicit information, requirements, acceptance criteria, and user stories, conversations that are being had during the stand-ups, during all of the other meetings, that's explicit information. In my opinion, explicit information should be used by everybody. So if we had a conversation about something and we updated the user story, that conversation should be referred to and therefore becomes explicit information. QE should not be in the job of ensuring that explicit information that has been readily available and accessible by the whole team has been met. That's individual people on the team's responsibility. I'm responsible for making sure that, of course, I'm using the explicit information, but that I'm also sharing the implicit information as well. And that's what makes a collaborative and modern quality engineer so much more valuable to the SDLC and our overall agile approach. So, talked a little bit about this, and we're going to talk why I believe that the refinement is one of the key components to bringing in the modernization of QE and supporting DevOps specifically, or fill in the blank, the next big thing to deliver software more optimized and more efficient. So again, old school refinement, right? It looks much like this. Where the entire project team, and maybe some lurkers, and you know who the lurkers are, the VPs, the business people, the CEOs that are kind of hanging out in the background, right? And all of a sudden they might pipe in and say, and we also need this by the end of December, right? And so we kind of have this team in here and other people who want to pay attention to what we're talking about, but it's generally the whole project team. So if your project team is more than 10 people, that can become a big meeting. We're usually in a big room, right? Well, it's a big, we don't have enough conference rooms, so we absolutely have to keep this time, and we have it for 2 hours, so we're going to expect to refine everything coming up for the next 2 weeks or the next 4 weeks or whatever, and we better be quick about it because we don't have enough time because we can't get conference rooms, right? We're cramming in as many possible stories in an hour or 2 hours, however long you're in there, right? So the idea is to simply check mark that we've refined these 10 stories or 15 stories or whatever in an hour, and the idea is to refine as much, or to get through the list, whether or not you actually have enough time to refine that. And so at the end of the hour, you say, okay, everybody, we're done with this refinement session, so let's start our work. And we're gonna plan this, if you're operating in a traditional sprint type of planning, we're gonna plan this next week at planning, but everybody good about refining? And everyone's like, sure, yes, I think so. And QA's like, it's the first time I've I've seen any of this work. I really need to do a little bit of homework, right? So that's a pretty typical refinement session. And it's important because the Agile thing says that we should be doing it, but we're not really taking advantage of it into what its true intent is, right? So let's talk a little bit about what the new school refinement looks like. So small working groups. A product manager, a product owner, a developer, a tester, or QE sitting in a room in an ad hoc fashion. Maybe there's a meeting scheduled, but the idea is that we've targeted the dev and the QE that are going to be working on it, either because from the dev standpoint, they know all about these features and these are the features that we're going to be refining, or QE, and simply because of the same way, right? So we've tested this before, we can actually speak to it. Shorter times, right? And so instead of an hour-long refinement session to where we focus on 20 plus stories, we're actually going to have shorter times, and we're going to have maybe 1 or 2 stories that need to be refined, maybe a little bit more, because as we get used to this, we get even more optimized and more efficient. And everyone is represented, and yes, even DevOps, because the idea is in the refinement sessions is that everyone that has responsibility to do something on this story is present and accounted for. And they're speaking, and the idea behind having it a smaller working session is that if you're in a group of 10 or more people in a room, you can check out and people probably won't pay much attention, right? If you're in a working session with 3 or maybe 4 people, it is much harder for you to check out and not participate or not be prepared, because you're going to have that kind of positive peer pressure with your working group. So the smaller working sessions are much more optimal to actually get the outcome of what is needed during this refinement. And it becomes a tiered approach. So where I mentioned earlier that we kind of put so much emphasis on this one and done refinement, and then that's it, and everybody starts their work, and the next time we see each other as a big group is either in the stand-up the next day or at the planning session, we're tiering approach this, right? And so we may come out of that first refinement session saying, okay, yep, we can start this next piece of work. And that may be, I'm going to code up the story, and QE's coming in and say, I'm going to start writing the outlines of tests that I had already talked about during this refinement session, but we have a couple of action items, and I won't be able to do this unless we get answers to this, right? And so it's being very deliberate in tracking the things that come out of that refinement, and then being willing and able to come back in once all that information is gathered and meet again, and maybe meet again, and maybe meet again. And again, this is not putting a bunch of meetings on your calendar. It's using that maybe those 8 minutes that you didn't use for the stand-up and going over to somebody's desk and re-refining what you refined before. The idea is that you're sharing the information that you have gathered not only during that initial refinement session, but all the information that you're gathering while you're starting to code and while you're starting to write to test, and you're actually retuning and re-refining that story so that by the time that dev is complete and that QE starts, that story, there's no surprises in that story. And we've actually vetted out a lot of the things so that we can actually start exploring the story, as I mentioned earlier, is one of the key components to take out of this, okay? All right, so one of the last modernization and kind of supporting DevOps is getting to the point where we're shippable. So shippable, in my opinion, is the new definition of done. So how many of you have heard of this term definition of done? Right? Everybody. If you've practiced any type of Agile, that's a pretty core component of the Agile method or approach. Definition of done has kind of been looked at belonging to the product owner. Well, we as a team, done means this, right? And so we kind of put it in this general category of if we can do these things, then we can consider the story done. I like to grab that and redefine it for each of the practices that are represented within the project team. So when I say practice, I mean development, product owner, QE, DevOps, Scrum Master, anyone that's kind of present in your, or who should be present in your daily stand-ups. That's a practice that sometimes we call them pillars, but essentially we have these core components for our software development, and we represent them on Agile project teams, and we have some sort of representation in our practices that are core to the delivery, the design, delivery, building, testing, and all that of a solution, right? So I've liked to kind of pull the definition of done and say, yep, we can absolutely have a definition of done that's owned by the product team and that kind of manages what does done mean for this team. But I like to actually create it so that it looks more like a playbook. So when we're in those columns of, well, I'm in development, and in order for us to get out of that column, what are the things that we're going to be doing? Well, from a dev standpoint, there should be a unit testing strategy in place, right? And so we trust that if there's a unit testing strategy in place, that dev is actually adhering to it, and we don't need to check, QE doesn't need to check that they are doing it, because that's going to be naturally coming out because they said they're going to do it. If they say they're going to do it, we need to trust that they're going to do it. And if they don't do it, then that's not our responsibility. That's probably their manager's responsibility, especially if it happens more and more and more and more, right? So the idea is to create this definition of done that becomes a playbook for each of the practices represented within the team so that it removes the guesswork. Well, did you do the unit testing? I don't have access to the results, so are they running green? I don't know, I'm not really sure. Well, that means that if I don't know what you've done from a unit testing strategy, then I'm going to feel the need and the responsibility to test everything, right? And that is a very flawed approach because I promise some sort of testing has been done, but just because we don't have access to what has been done or we're not actively sharing that information, QE feels this innate need to test everything, which introduces redundancy and obviously inefficiency into our thing. So we're spending time doing things that may have already been done, but because we don't have insight into whether or not it's been done, we make the assumption it hasn't, and now we've done double duty sometimes in testing that's already been taken care of, right? So when we have a definition of done that actually equals a playbook for each of the practices, each of the practices can refer to that definition of done playbook so that they don't have to guesswork. They don't have the guesswork in there, okay? It also kind of removes the silo. So we're moving into this component of I'm not done as a developer because I've moved this story out of in dev into dev complete or into ready for testing, whatever that next column is. There's this whole concept of great, so my dev is complete, my testing is complete, product has accepted this. Now what the hell do we need to do to move this in so that our users can actively consume all of this great work that we've done over the last several weeks or days or whatever, right? So the idea is that we're removing the silos of dev complete, QA complete, product management, and DevOps complete, and we're actually actively having conversations about what do we need to do to make this shippable and not just complete. Essentially, it's put the red bow on it, right? And so we can have a nice wrapped or nice gift that we've bought from the store for Christmas or for a birthday. We can put it in a nice little gift bag and all that. But really what winds up happening is when we know it's done is when that little red bow is complete on there. That little red bow means, hey, this is ready to be consumed. Whether I decide to open it immediately or whether I wait a few weeks until that birthday, the idea is that that red bow is kind of that indicator that we are done, but that we're really done to the point where we're shippable. Some components that we should be considering when we become shippable is that we've addressed tech debt, right? We accrue it. Everybody accrues it. We've tended to think that this is only a developer type of analogy or a responsibility or activity, that tech debt, but QA, QE, automation, performance, all the things, everybody accrues tech debt. That's just a natural occurrence of developing software. The idea is how do we address tech debt? So if you, as developers or testers, don't have the ability to write stories, if you are if you need to have somebody write a story on your behalf, get out of the habit of needing to have somebody else write a story. Write the story of tech debt as you're coming up on it, right? So the idea is that we put those stories that address the tech debt into the backlog, and every sprint or so, or every now and then when it gets to the point where it's accrued, we can actually address that tech debt then and there, and we have that fresh memory because we've had the ability to create that story. The red bow on it again is that the automation, all automation, whether it's coming from the testing team or from development, all of it is green, and it's running in the pipeline. And this is the core component of DevOps, especially for the automation component, is that the pipeline is running green. By introducing a better way to automate tests within the story and to tie that test automation in as a shippable component within that story, that avoids a lot of the residual symptoms of a not highly optimized or highly efficient pipeline, because it allows us to truly ship a fully baked, fully tested, fully automated story. And then that story is not considered done or shippable until all of those things are in there. So our tech debt is addressed. Our automation is green and in the pipeline, whether it's coming from test or whether it's coming from development. Another piece in here, and this may vary with your company or with your team, we like to say all Sev 1 and 2 bugs that we've found during our testing cycle have been closed. And anything that's not closed should be handled by product. Product should be prioritizing the work that's coming in, and they should have a very good story as to why we are allowing a known Sev 1 or Sev 2 to be released into production. And a lot of times there are some really great reasons to do that. But the idea is that we start putting more data around whether or not we're ready to ship, so that when it comes time to pushing that shippable button, which is the ultimate outcome of a continuous deployment pipeline, is that we can rely on the data to track all of the shippable components that are valuable to the team, so that we can get to that point where we are operating much like that DevOps approach. All P1 or P2 test cases are these are non-automated test cases are running green, right? So they're passed. They're passed, and if they had bugs previously associated with them because they'd failed at some point in time, they're now running green. There are all sorts of ways that we should be bringing in our tools so that it's a dashboard and it's not left to one person on the team, i.e. QA, to make the decision of whether or not we're ready to ship. We're relying on the data that is meaningful to everyone represented in our SDLC, and we're allowing that data to do its job, which is to indicate whether or not we're ready to ship, and then simply tying in the components so that we can ship. So just because you can ship doesn't mean you should, right? So when you get that last story and it's now in this shippable component, you may make the decision to not ship it. You may not quite be or continuously delivering your software. You probably will get there very soon, especially given the trends of where we need to be. No longer are we going to be able to get by with quarterly releases or monthly releases. We need to move into a continuous deployment type of approach for delivering our software. And by being able to kind of tie these components being optimized and efficient, just because we want to get to the point where the only decision of whether or not we need to ship is whether or not the users are ready for us, not because we have to tie off all these loose ends to get us to shippable. And just because you could, that might not mean that you did. And again, it's kind of just putting another little bit of a probably more confusing quote on that, but the idea is that we're getting the team prepared to not only think about dev complete, test complete, and PO accepted, but all of the other things that make it into an actual shippable component. So get to shippable if you can. So with that said, here are the things that we kind of talked about a little bit, right? So the idea is that we want to look at some of the activities from a testing standpoint that have been part of our industry and that we've been doing for sometimes many years, sometimes decades. And we want to ask the right questions. Why are we doing this? But most importantly, when we identify waste or things that may be inefficient, what happens if we stop? Will somebody's hair going to fire? Is everything going to fall down? Or is it just simply one of those activities that we've done with no real purpose? We're going to look at a better way to look at test automation. We want to remove driving test automation from test cases alone. We want to have that quality engineer with deep test automation experience be very consultative in those refinement meetings versus waiting until a manual tester comes in, tests everything, then indicates a few test cases for automation, and then push that further down the line, right? We want to bring in those people, those quality engineers that can be consultative with those more specialized areas, like test automation, like accessibility. We want to bring those into the fold. And by optimizing and being efficient, and addressing the things that may have caused us to be inefficient, we can actually find more room in our day-to-day to bring in more activities that provide higher value to our customers, but more importantly, we may be able to bring in activities that we previously had not been able to do, which kind of it allows for professional development. We're learning a new skill, we're learning a new activity, we're learning a new service, but we're also doing it within the confines of the way that our project team is currently organized, and we're looking at the modernization of DevOps to help kind of guide some of those principles and bake those into our existing QE role and what we do on the day-to-day. Okay, so here's my contact information. We have got a little bit of time left. So first I'd like to yes, got a question. And I think we've got the cube here.
So who?
Right here.
I just get to keep it?
No, you get to speak into it.
Okay.
It's your own mic.
Okay.
There we go.
Wow. So we spoke of QA versus QE, where in the QA world, there's a difference between the devs and the product and the QA, and therefore QA is kind of forced to test everything, and therefore the result is that huge regression test suite that runs for like 8 hours overnight, and then much of it can be ignored by the next person who comes in, right?
Yes.
So the question is, now you're at that spot where you have this huge suite of tests, and you want to shift left, and you're getting into a culture where people talk to each other, tell each other what they're doing, and now you want to break up this suite and put it in the pipeline, and you don't want it to run for 8 hours because it is not as useful anyway. So how do you begin to break this huge suite into cases that are probably more manageable?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, and that's a very relevant question because it's exactly what we do. So now we say, and I'm doing that right now. So what we do is we logically organize that suite into features. And hopefully that's, I mean, from some organizations are organized slightly different, but most everybody should have the concept of features. So the idea is that sometimes you may need to refactor that automation. And so what we've tended to do is the reason why those monolithic suites are taking 6, 8, 10 hours to run is because they're testing everything, right? Or we've built this whole thing. And that is not a bad idea. But in order to get us to the point where we are now delivering automation as a service to our developers and they're pulling those things. So I'm working on these 3 features. Where is the automation that satisfies these 3 features? And then we pull those 3 features and we run those scripts independently or in conjunction with the other. And the way that we can start doing that and making even those more optimized is that we kind of break those down into basic building blocks. I like to start off with a smoke test. So we look at the feature and say, okay, what does the smoke test, how would you define the smoke test for this feature? And sometimes even the term smoke test can be very subjective and it may mean something differently to another. So if that's the case, even more breaking it down is to use the CRUD approach, create, rate, update, delete. And if any of those 4 actions are applicable to that feature, that becomes the basic building block of automation. And then if you can do that for all of the features within your product, then at least you have those tests are running in milliseconds, if not less, right? So you leave the monolithic suite alone in some cases, and that may be valuable, but maybe you don't run that every night. Maybe you run that once a week or twice a week because you've now replaced that with much more feedback, instantaneous feedback that's actually tied to your pipeline. So I start off with a smoke test, defining it by CRUD if it's not already clearly defined and not only just clearly defined, but well understood by everybody. That's the first step that we do.
Thank you.
Another question over here? Nice.
So, first of all, a great presentation. I think it sums up everything well. I did check on the site, and these materials are not posted
They're not there, okay.
So I want to get those materials before I get out of here today.
Okay.
So I'll probably be emailing you.
I promise I will email them to you, but they'll be posted up there as soon as they get to them. Yep.
Okay.
Okay. Yep.
Are they recording these sessions, by the way?
This one is being
Will
recorded.
they post those recordings or make them on the YouTube channel? Awesome. Okay. So my question is, so in your distinction between a QA and a QE, so you see the QE as being, and you had the quote up there about influencing the development process,
The building of
right?
the software.
Right, the
yep.
building of the software, correct. So one of the challenges that I find, especially in the agile environment, is the PMs or the product owners, when you're having your Scrum discussion, when you're doing refinement, or when you're doing your planning, okay, is when you have your QAs bringing up things like testability or bringing up things like we need an API to test this with or things like that.
Yep.
There's enormous pushback because that's not a deliverable product, right? And so do you have any recommendations, ways? Because what I feel like sometimes when you come to these conferences is it's like preaching to the choir, right? And I wish that every PM and every person involved in the entire development process could hear these types of presentations so they understand the value that it brings. But what would your recommendation be? So as a QE, and you're trying to influence that design, and they say, well, we don't want to put in the time for that because that's not a deliverable, right? That's not a customer value feature. How would you approach that?
Well, I would use the traditional definitions of what AC is. So AC, in and of itself, means that if you met these ACs, the product kind of prioritizes that to say if you've done this, these 10 ACs that are responsive to this story, then we would consider this done, and it becomes a minimum viable product. MVP is the easiest thing to deliver, essentially, right? We provide value with all the other things around there. So guiding those conversations to say, in order for us to, and so that means that AC should be written with testable, buildable, demoable, and shippable. So those are the IBLs that we kind of use to guide our refinements. And we use those and say, in order for this AC to be testable or the story to be considered testable, we need an API. That means that our sizing of the story is probably going to increase, but that translates into a higher quality product because we're actually building those 4 IBLs into the AC that's part of the story. That's one way that we've done. What I've found still is that the IBLs are not really widely understood or built into ACs, and so that's not a driving component when we drive these refinements. That's like the first thing that we do. Before we even get into a refinement session, we ensure that those ACs are meeting all 4 of those IBLs in there before we can even get into the refinement session. So we're kind of putting a lot of responsibility back on the product owner to create that story to the point where we can actually vet it out and get to the point where that refinement is it's a highly working session because all the other things that we tend to vet out in the refinement sessions have already been vetted out. So we use that as a guiding component before the story is being written. And I do have refinement guidelines that I've built, and I'm happy to share them if you want to contact me. I can give you an example of like the things that QE is responsible for when we get into a refinement session, and those have actually been Dev has responsibility, PO has responsibility, and each of the practices, once they saw that we created refinement guidelines for QE, it was so successful that they did the same thing. So now we have this like refinement guidelines that all of the teams kind of work through as a checklist, not as a prescriptive thing, but hey, don't forget to talk about this and don't forget that this needs to happen and all that. So that's kind of the outcome and the result of that.
Okay.
Yeah. I think we are at time. Are we at time now? Yep. A little bit over? Okay.
over.
Thank you so much, everybody.